Thank you very much, Chris and Rebecca, for the introduction. So yeah, it's my pleasure to be here. I hope this will give you some insight on Ebola Zaire transmission. But first, let's start with a bit of context. The outbreak we will be speaking of is the 10th Ebola outbreak in DRC that occurred between 2018 and 2020 across the north provinces of Ituri, North Kivu, and South Kivu. The outbreak was the second largest ever recorded outbreak of Ebola, with more than 3,400 cases, an overall case fatality rate of 66%, and was caused by the Ebola Zaire virus. Now, this outbreak was characterized by numerous security incidents, including attacks against the response activities, but it was also the first outbreak where ring vaccination were deployed very early on, alongside the traditional pillars of an Ebola response, including the now famous contact tracing activities. Now, throughout the presentation, I will be talking about chains of transmission. It's a concept you may have heard from other diseases like COVID and antivirus, but it's particularly relevant for Ebola. So, simply put, a chain of transmission is a type of representation of infection event where we try to answer one simple question: who infected who? To do this, epidemiologists have two approaches. Let's assume we have 4 infected Ebola cases. If the activities are well in place and that these cases are identified early enough, we can register, follow up, and monitor all of their contacts. This is commonly known as forward contact tracing and is routinely done in Ebola outbreaks. Now, some of these contacts will develop the disease and therefore be assigned as secondary cases of our main cases. Some of them will not get the disease and will be excluded from the chains of transmission. In parallel to this, epidemiologists can conduct very extensive and meticulous case investigations where they retrospectively link cases to their known infector. Now we can combine both approaches and reconstruct the so-called chains of transmission. Now, as you can see, this process is imperfect, and we typically end up with these kinds of chains where we have missing links and cases completely unlinked. Nevertheless, these are very valuable pieces of information that we can use to better understand the transmission profile behind the disease. And this is exactly what we've been doing with this retrospective analysis. What do chains of transmission on this outbreak tell us about the outbreak itself? We will be focusing on 3 things. First, we looked at the missing transmission links and see what they tell us on our response. Then we had a look at the number of secondary cases and understand how was transmission distributed. And finally, we looked at case characteristics and what they tell us on the drivers of this transmission. Let's start with the missing links. As I just said, the chains of transmission are only partially observed, mainly due to challenges during contact tracing. What we see in our outbreak is that 56% of our cases were linked to their ancestor or infector. These are in blue in the mock chain, and 44% of them could not be linked to their infector. Now we can take these and look how they're distributed across time. And if we classify cases based on if we know or don't know their infector, then we can retrieve the proportion of cases that were linked every week. Now, simply put, what we observe is that right before the peak, this proportion of cases linked to their infector was very low. It was about 20% by December 2018. Now, as the epidemic progressed, the proportion of cases linked to the infector greatly improved, up to 80% by December 2019. Now, recall that this outbreak was characterized by many security incidents. If we look at, including 9 attacks on healthcare centers, healthcare workers, and health centers. Now, if we look at the timing of these events, which are in yellow here, we see that they very neatly overlap with our periods of lower case linkage. So keeping in mind that this is probably a multifactorial process, it does seem to tell us that violences impacted the quality of the contact tracing and thus lowered our ability to see and reconstruct the chains of transmission. Now let's move to the number of secondary cases. So here the question is simple. How was transmission distributed? And to do this, I'm going back to our simple chain, but for simplicity, we're assuming that it's fully reconstructed. Just know that in our analysis, we are adjusting for the missing links. The first thing we see is that a vast majority of cases do not infect anyone. It's 73% in our outbreak. a much smaller proportion of cases infected 1 person, 23 people infected 5%, and then a merely 17 people infected more than 10%, with one individual infected up to 29 people. So simply put here, what we see is that we have a vast majority of people who do not infect, and a tiny proportion of cases who infect a huge proportion of them. This is commonly known as heterogeneity in transmission. And we say the transmission is heterogeneous, and we can better describe it by saying that 80% of cases were infected by only 18% of cases. Now, if we look at this minority of cases who contributed to the biggest part of the outbreak and see how they distributed across time, that's what we see. And these are in red here. Now, very roughly speaking, we observe that this heterogeneity is stable across the outbreak, especially before the peak, during the episodes of violence, during the period where transmission was highest, right after the peak, and at the end of the outbreak, always fluctuating around 20% of cases infected 80% of them. Now, this tells us, all this together tells us many things. First, we know that there is heterogeneity in Ebola transmission. It was described for the West African outbreak, and we are showing here that it's also present in DRC context. It seems to be an inherent feature of Ebola transmission and needs to be continuously monitored during ongoing and future outbreaks. Now we see that this heterogeneity is stable, especially during the violence. Other periods are increased transmission. It means that during the peak, on average, everyone transmitted more, but the level of heterogeneity remained the same. To us, that means that during these periods, what we see is the transmission profile of the disease did not change. What changed was our ability to act on it due to incomplete response activities. Now let's move to the case characteristics. We've just seen that some cases transmit more than others, and we also know they've got characteristics, for example, the isolation status. We have all these informations. So what we can do is we can explore the association between the number of secondary cases and these variables of interest. So let me note here that all the results that will be presented are adjusted for the missing links and for the confounders. We first started to look at the response pillars, our core response pillars, and how they impact transmission. The first thing we see is for isolation. Cases never isolated had 1.79 more secondary cases than cases that were isolated in our ETCs. In terms of contact tracing, we observed that cases that were never registered and never followed up had, on average, 4.5 more secondary cases than cases that were never registered and never followed up. When we look at vaccination, we see that cases that were not vaccinated had, on average, 3 times more secondary cases than cases that were vaccinated. Now, all this tells us, we emphasize and it quantifies the importance of these core response pillars. We know that rapid isolation, successful contact tracing, and ring vaccination cut transmissions. Now, when we looked at the other variables of interest, it gives us insight on the mechanisms of this transmission. What we see is that all the variables which are proxies for prolonged time in the community while being infectious, such as never being isolated, dying outside of an ETC, not being registered as a contact, or the more days you spend in the communities, are all very strongly associated with higher transmission. Now, variables which are proxies for severe disease, such as wet symptoms or higher viral load, they're also associated with higher transmission, but to a lesser extent. Finally, we could not find any evidence of an association between increased transmission and the occupation, including a transport occupation or healthcare workers, but also sex and age. So that was a lot. Let me wrap all this together. If there are 3 things I want you to retain from this analysis of the chains of transmission of the 10th outbreak, is that first, there is heterogeneity in Ebola transmission. We know that it is stable, and we need to continuously monitor it. Now, the second thing, our main I spoiled it, sorry. Our main response activities, namely effective contact tracing, rapid isolation, and ring vaccinations, are effective at cutting down transmission, and mainly because they reduce the time that infectious individuals spend in the community. However, we know that attacks on healthcare centers, but also on the response, and overall community mistrust impacted our ability to effectively conduct these activities. So I know Ebola is scary, but it's important to note that Ebola is controllable and we have the tools for it. Now, the main challenge is how to effectively apply those tools. And it must start with long-term trust-building community engagement in the community we're working for. Now, I hope with this presentation that you will understand chains of transmission are valuable during and after outbreaks. Also know that we have models to infer these chains of transmission and reconstruct them, even in the field with partial data. And let me remind you that all this work was about Ebola Zaire virus, and it needs to be done for the current Ebola Bundibugyo outbreak. With this, let me thank all the people I've been working on. And I guess this presentation is dedicated to everyone involved in the current response, whether it's from the field up to the computer. Thank you very much.